Okay, so in this last video for this module, I want to talk about some different patterns. So we just sort of talked about what the theory of island biogeography is and outlined looked at some of those patterns, specific patterns that we see in biodiversity, specifically biodiversity in terms of species richness, which is just usually the number of species. But instead of just looking at, the count of how many species there are, I want to look at what some patterns in the specific types of species, basically what species are actually there. Instead of just counting them, this is usually referred to as species composition. So let's look at some of those patterns. Um, Basically, species compositions of terrestrial vertebrates tend to be different. Not even vertebrates, just species compositions in general tend to be different, whether you're dealing with the mainland versus the island. So basically, we're looking at New Guinea and the islands of northern Melanesia here. And we're looking for snakes and lizards and mammals and frogs here. And basically what you're seeing is the proportion of each group here of snakes and lizards and whatever, the proportion on the mainland versus on the island. And basically here for snakes, there's actually not a huge difference. The proportions are pretty similar for these different clades. I think these are probably families of snakes. But for lizards, well, actually, lizards are not that different either. And mammals, basically, mammals and frogs, are where you start to see some differences. There is a little bit of differences here. Basically, looking at the size of these proportions on the island and comparing them to the size on the mainland and seeing if they're different. And here you can see for bats in mammals, there's a big difference. They're much more prevalent on the island than they are on the mainland. And if we're looking at frogs, then this specific family here, which is this Ranidae, I'm not familiar with that species, but it's much more prevalent on the island than it is compared to the mainland. And this family is much less prevalent on the island than it is on the mainland. Marsupials, if we go back to mammals, I'm just kind of looking for trends here. If we go back to mammals, the marsupials on this island or on these islands are much less prevalent than on the mainland. So while the count of species matters, you're going to get different patterns depending on what species you're actually talking about. And it's a result of the differences in the immigration abilities among species that causes what's called this disharmonic nature of island biotas, which increases with isolation. And disharmonic just means that basically they're not in harmony, which is to say that they're not corresponding. Like the abundances of a given species does on the island doesn't necessarily correspond to how abundant it is on the mainland. So here we're seeing mainland again versus isolation, and just sort of seeing that those abundances change quite a bit with increasing isolation. So yeah, the species, you see these trends just in the number of species, but there's actually more nuanced stuff going on. And it's going to depend on, how well a given species can immigrate or disperse to a new area. And there's some crazy examples, but there's different. So here we're just seeing like I think sort of the longest known dispersal for different groups. Some of them are, I mean, actually really impressive, but there's obviously different between these different types of organisms. You have terrestrial mammals, large mammals, 50 kilometers or more. Small mammals, 300 kilometers. Rodents and bats can disperse pretty far. And this is two islands. This isn't necessarily across. This is oceanic dispersal, I guess I should say, not necessarily land dispersal. And reptiles, there's some really, I mean, lizards, 1,500 kilometers to New Zealand, 3,000 for insects and spiders. So some pretty impressive dispersal rates, but obviously different depending on whether you're looking at terrestrial mammals or reptiles or amphibians or insects and Plants, are going to be different as well. So you're going to get different types of species depending on the situation. If we consider things to be equal, then species with relatively low resource requirements tend to be disproportionately more common on islands. And so if we're looking at, again, this we're going back to the Great Basin, so we're not actually looking at oceanic islands, just areas that are isolated. And we're looking at the number of mountain ranges with these species present, these species being habitat generalists or habitat specialists. And we can see that as body mass increases, the number of mountain ranges decreases for that. If you have a body mass out here, you're going to be present on fewer mountain ranges than if you have a body mass which is less. But basically, the trends are the same, but different magnitudes for habitat generalist versus habitat specialist. You can see that these values are just higher than these values are here, basically because they're generalists. They can exist in more places than a specialist can, just sort of by definition. And same thing going on here, just sort of differentiating between sort of forest types. Kind of a weird figure. I'm not sure why they didn't just combine these two. But yeah, just that sort of thing. Basically, the resource requirements is going to have an influence as well. This gets back to this idea of endemicity, or basically just how the proportion of species that are endemic. And this figure is a little tricky to interpret, but basically saying larger islands with a greater area, which is this axis is gonna. So if you're a larger island and you're more isolated, so this is isolation, this is area, then those two things combined contribute to the highest levels of endemic species being present. So it's a 3D plot. I don't really like these plots, but what you're seeing is you see this peak, and this peak corresponds to high levels of isolation and high levels of area, or large values of area. A little bit easier to see here. We can just see isolation. As isolation increases for these islands or areas, then the percent of endemic species increases. But it's also going to matter which type of species you're looking at, whether it's snakes or bats or lizards or birds or rodents, that you're not seeing the same levels of endemicity among all of them. Similarly, down here, the island types and the organisms are going to matter as well, as far as whether islands have been around for a long time or whether they're fairly new is gonna matter. So there's a lot more nuanced stuff going on than just isolation and area, even though those two things have a very large influence on these patterns. Um, Another interesting way to look at this is functional traits. So if you remember sort of back to our function versus structure conversations, ecologists sometimes like to group organisms based on their functions rather than what species they are and things like that. So here's looking at functional traits of vascular plants, which are strongly correlated with the isolation of the island. So all these figures have isolation on the x-axis, and we have different values. We're looking at different things on our y-axis. So this is leaf area. So leaf area tends to increase with the isolation of the island. The amount of leaf dry matter tends to decrease with the isolation. Leaf nitrogen tends to increase, and vegetative height tends to decrease. So interesting things going on there at the trait level and the functional level, which can have influences on productivity, but can give other insights into how things are competing with one another and all sorts of climate and biotic interactions and things like that. So interesting stuff going on. This is a interesting story here. So this is the summary of the systematics and basically the story of the New Zealand moas, where they are flightless. And so these are birds that can't fly, and so the basically it's like the question is how did they get there? These birds probably didn't swim, probably are not great swimmers. So how did they get to this island? The original thinking was that it was sort of a vicarious event where they were present, on New Zealand when it was connected to, I think, Pangaea, or Antarctica after it split off. I don't remember the timeline, but basically they thought it was present before it became an island, and then it split off, and then they were just stuck there. However, when they looked at some of the phylogenetic things and the mitochondrial phylogenetics and the phylogeography and some of those taxon area cladograms and those types of studies, basically these splits were not lining up with the geologic timeline. And so you could conclude that, okay, they did not show up until, if they didn't show up until after the split of New Zealand from other land masses, then you can't say it was vicarious. They had to have gotten there by dispersal. And in fact, they did get there by dispersal. What happened was that they dispersed there and then evolved flightlessness, or basically they lost the ability to fly after showing up there. And I'll come back to this in a minute because it's actually kind of interesting. But basically in essence, what happens is that when you have these organisms that show up to islands, and the island community is different than the community of the mainland, you get what can be a niche shift, or a shift in the niche space from the organisms. Basically, they're occupying a different niche. So an example of this is voles and shrews. So voles are the prey of shrews. Shrews are the predators of voles. And so if we look at islands with and without shrews, and we're looking at the density of voles, we see if you have shrews, then the density is really high in grassland habitats. But if the island does not have shrews, then the density is high in forests. And if we look at the density of the shrews on islands with and without voles, we can say with voles, they tend to be all over the place. Without voles, they tend to be in the forests pretty much exclusively because there's probably more resources for them. So the niche can shift depending on the community of the island, which is kind of interesting and actually leads to all kinds of weird and funky things. On the Bahamian Islands, if the island's lacking predatory lizards, then spiders exhibit what's called predatory release. So basically, they did these experiments in the 80s where they removed some of the predator species of lizards, and they looked at the number of spiders. I think probably the number of species of spiders, but it might actually, I don't know, that might be either numbers or species diversity. The pattern is kind of the same either way, and that you get this increase if you have the lizards removed, then the population basically increases. But if you have either unenclosed plots or plots that had lizards, there's not a whole lot of difference because lizards were present in the mainland. But basically, if you remove the lizards, then you get this release, this population release. And again, I'll come back to this. Actually, I'm not going to come back to it. We're going to talk about it right now. So basically, you get these different ecological and environmental pressures, evolutionary pressures on organisms once they get to an island, and that can have some dramatically different impacts on how organisms diversify once they get there. One of them is this evolved flightlessness on islands. So there's actually a number of examples of this. There's these organisms, there was the moas, but there's these insects as well, and these birds that tend to, basically, if you're a species that can fly and you disperse out to an island, you get there. That helps you get there, but being able to fly doesn't necessarily help you once you're on the island. And those species can evolve in weird ways that basically just whatever is beneficial to your survival and reproduction on the island is what's going to be selected for. And it's not necessarily going to be flight. And so it's actually pretty common that organisms that can fly lose their ability to fly if they exist on an island long enough. And we see it in lots of different types of organisms. So it's sort of this flightlessness that can evolve from organisms showing up there, which is pretty interesting. Plants have this different sort of thing where they tend to evolve tree-like stature and woodiness when they show up on islands. So that may not be a trait that helps you get to the island. Obviously, being able to disperse your seeds really far is probably more beneficial, obviously, to getting to the island. But then once they get there, even if the mainland descendant, which they came from, was not a tree, woodiness can evolve actually really, really quickly, like within years and decades. Plants can evolve woody-like structures, which might help with competition, might help with resource availability and other sorts of things. But it's pretty interesting that we see this pattern a lot too. Another characteristic that tends to change once organisms arrive on an island is the size of an island. So here, or sorry, the size of the organism. So here we're looking at lemurs and colonized Madagascar from Africa. And if we look, there was an ancestor that showed up, and we're seeing the body size here. So it's about 500 to 1,000 grams. So an intermediate body size was the ancestor, but once it showed up on these islands or on the island, diversified quite a bit and expanded in size. Like most of these clades got much, much bigger than the original ancestor. Some of them were a little bit smaller, but most of them got bigger. And this is actually a trend that I want to talk about here a little bit more. It's this trend called the island rule, and the island rule refers to the trend towards gigantism in small species of mammals and dwarfism in large species. So basically, what's going on here is your body size. So here you have the body size of the mainland population, and you have the body size of the island population. And so if this is 1. So basically this means that the body size is equal, is basically how they're plotting this out. It's sort of a ratio. So if this dashed line means that there's no difference, basically your size on the island is roughly the same size as your size on the mainland. What's going on here is that for small organisms, they tend to be larger. So you see these larger values, all of these, and we're looking at different types of whether they're rodents or carnivores or insects or whatever. Basically, all these points are above this dashed line, means that they're trending towards larger. These are larger organisms on the island than their populations are, or those organisms are on the mainland. And what's going on over here is dwarfism. So basically most of these points down here are below the line. So basically saying that when these species exist on an island, individuals are smaller than individuals of the same species on the mainland. And this is a really common thing. It's this island rule where organisms, if you're a small organism, you tend to increase in size when you get to the island of over a few generations or thousands of years or whatever it is. If you're a large organism, then you tend to shrink in size when you get to the island. So that's the island rule. Large organisms tend to get bigger, small organisms tend to get larger. And we don't just see it in existing organisms, we actually see it in fossils. So here we're looking at some fossil species, and we see the same trend where, here's the line, here's the one line, the equal line. So it's at 1 here. So organisms, smaller organisms, are larger here on islands than their mainland counterparts tended to be, and here they're smaller, and so it's the same sort of thing. And these refer to larger organisms and smaller organisms. So it's this dwarfism, gigantism thing. If you're a large organism on the mainland, you're probably going to shrink when you go to the island. At least, not you as an individual, but individuals in subsequent populations will be smaller. And is the opposite trend if you're a large organism. So that's the island rule. Kind of interesting. And you get these interesting things that show up when you add human dynamics into this. So here we're looking at the approximate size of the ancestors and the size of existing individuals, and whether like it's the current size or the size prior to colonization. We can see that you get this decreasing trend, and basically this decreasing trend between even within these different groups. And basically, like what's going on here is humans tended to hunt out the largest ones. So there's this predatory pressure that causes these organisms to shrink in size in response to coming into exposure with humans. Basically, we're a pretty good, effective predator, unfortunately. So that's what you sort of see. And the island rule is sort of the reverse of this. Sorry, I'll come back to that in a second. But yeah, basically we're seeing the same thing here, where you're getting this gigantism and dwarfism in certain species. So this is a dwarf elephant. It's only 90 centimeters in height. Pictures don't necessarily show that relative size, but this is a shrew. I think it's called like the terrible shrew or something. Looks pretty mean. But it's 75 centimeters in length there. So larger shrew, smaller elephant exhibiting. And then there's trends for lots of these different organisms. You can see that in this area, but this is all during the Pleistocene and the Pliocene. So it's not something that just happened now in our time period. We see this going back in time as well. But yeah, going back to what I was talking about, the island rule trend may result from selective forces that the importance varies with body size of the ancestral species. So basically, if you're a smaller species on the mainland, then immigrant selection for larger individuals, so larger individuals are probably going to be the ones that are able to get there, and then ecological release from larger species, those two things combined are probably what contributes to gigantism. So you're a small species, only the largest individuals of your species are going to be able to make it there, and then once they make it there, they're under very different ecological pressures and maybe actually get release from some of those pressures of the mainland and can increase in size. If you're a large species on the mainland, on the mainland x-axis here, large species on this end, you're going to encounter resource limitation when you get to the island. It's an island, there's not as many resources. And then you may get released from predators, and and that will allow you to, you don't have to be as large of an organism anymore. So those things combined could contribute to a shrinkage of the body size. So that's probably what's going on there as far as the gigantism and dwarfism. Interestingly, we see this scenario not just in islands, but in any sort of isolated sort of thing where we have marine gastropods here exhibiting the geographic trend in body size that's analogous to the island rule, where you basically they're larger if the sort of mainland species, if you can think of that here, that's shallow species and deep sea species, but this would basically be the mainland species and the island species. This would be gigantism, and this would be dwarfism here. So it's a very similar sort of trend that's going on. It really comes down to the isolation and different ecological conditions once an organism gets to that isolated space. Okay, I'm going to very quickly wrap up this. This video has been going on for a little bit, so bear with me here and we'll wrap this up. Basically, there's some interesting other things that can cause things to be endangered more easily, which I don't think is news to anybody. But here we're seeing the only pollinator, frugivore, and seed disperser of the critically endangered this flower species, Rusia simplex of the Maridus. It's the blue-tailed gecko. Basically, this gecko is the only thing that's able to keep this flower in existence because it's the only one that actually disperses and pollinates this species. So that's some interesting things that can go on there, and obviously that's not going to be that can contribute to higher levels of or higher probabilities of being endangered or becoming extinct. And it's actually the ultimate fate of all organisms. Pretty much, if you disperse to an island, you undergo this. Basically, there's these stages where you show up to an island. Maybe you show up from a mainland to a chain of islands, and originally maybe you're widespread, but over time, like you as a species begin to diversify and maybe are no longer present on some of them. Maybe you evolve into other species, and then maybe at some point, eventually, basically the ultimate fate is that you're going to go extinct of any species. Like you evolve and diversify, and either you change into a new species or you don't exist anymore. So that's basically what's going on there. And you kind of see it a little bit more clearly where they're showing this graphical model of the processes of basically what's the process of showing up to an island and your population numbers are high, and then maybe they shrink and you go through these cyclical things. But the ultimate fate is that you're probably going to go extinct. Basically, you're going from what I want to say here, like you show up and there's probably not that much competition and things like that, but then as other organisms show up, there's competition, and then you evolve to fit that competition, and then maybe over time the island becomes more isolated, and so your gene flow decreases, and over time you might diversify, but your population levels are probably going to shrink here. They're also putting this on a weird sort of habitat gradient, which I think confuses things a little bit. But basically, you're going to probably go extinct over time or evolve into a new species over time. And that's just what this is outlining here. I'm not going to go through all this. Basically, stage one is the initial expansion, and then you have ecological and evolutionary specialization, and then you have a contraction of the species, and then single island endemics that exist. And they only exist on those islands because they're endemic and eventually end up going extinct over long enough time periods. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. There's a reading about an interesting little chameleon called the nano chameleon. So keep working your way through the module, go through that reading, and then this is the last video. So I will see you next week in next week's module.